So good afternoon and welcome to our first conversation in Christian-Muslim dialogue. I'm Joshua Ralston. I'm a reader in Christian-Muslim relations at the University of Edinburgh, and I direct the Christian-Muslim Studies Network, which is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm really excited that our first conversation can be with Professor Klaus von Stosch, who's professor of Catholic theology at the University of Paderborn. He's also the director and founder of the Center for Comparative Theology and Cultural Studies in Paderborn, which is one of the world-leading institutions in the study of comparative theology. So we're going to have a conversation about some of his past work and current work, and talk a little bit about Christian-Muslim dialogue and the limits and possibilities of comparative theology. So welcome, Professor von Stosch.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so just to get us started, you were trained and educated as a Catholic theologian. What brought you initially to engage with Islamic studies and Islamic thought?
It was more the problem that I saw that theology of religion doesn't lead to a good end. So I was thrilled even before I started with my studies with the question how to bring together the question of truth of Christian belief, especially the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, with a kind of appreciation of other religions. So I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't find any of the normal models of theology of religions convincing. So I started to search for something else. And this more theoretical interest brought me to comparative theology because I read some of the texts like from Jim Fredericks and others who propose comparative theology as an alternative to theology of religions. And in the beginning, I wanted to explore that theoretically, and then I got more and more fascinated through working on Islam and together with Muslims.
So what was it initially about comparative theology that maybe drew you in, that thought could give more answers to the problems than theologies of religion?
I like very much that it's so concrete. It tries to solve concrete problems, and you try to work with concrete partners. You read their books and try to find solutions. So it's not on that abstract level of comparing religion as a whole, but working on a certain figure of certain problems. So this is more exciting, and it leads to some results. Another point was also, which I might have to mention, why I chose Islam as a religion, might be that I was several times in Morocco as a very young man because my sister is married with a Muslim. And these experiences were very exciting and made me curious to learn more about that religion.
Yeah. So I know you co-edited a book on meaning and method in comparative theology. Could you say a little bit about what are some of the unique challenges that Judaism and Islam present to Christian comparative theology? Most of, especially English-speaking comparative theology, is primarily focused on Eastern traditions. Do you think there's anything in particular that Judaism and Islam present to a Christian comparative theology that's important to attend to methodologically?
Yeah, of course, Judaism and Islam are much closer to the Christian tradition, and so it's much more difficult to see different approaches to truth in those religions. They seem to contradict each other quite explicitly. They take of the same prophets, they talk of Jesus, of Mary, of the different figures that are so important for our Christian religious tradition. And in many times they contradict us. So this has to be engaged and faced, and it's not so difficult to appreciate the difference here because the difference often is a contradiction. But on the other hand, it's also sometimes it seems to be very obvious that there is a contradiction, but if you dig deeper, you will see that it is not, that sometimes there are contradictions where you think that there is a similarity, and there are similarities where you think that there is a contradiction. So it's what is so exciting here is that seem to understand a lot in the beginning, and then you learn more and more that you don't understand so much and that you have to dig deeper. Whereas in Eastern religions, you don't seem to understand anything in the beginning. Then later, you will see that there might be some complementarity of both ways, or whatever comparative theologians discover there. But I think this easy beginning and getting more sophisticated when you go through, that's very fascinating.
Yeah, in the book that you wrote, which in English we might translate as, I don't know, The Challenge of Islam, Christian Answers, or The Question of Islam, Christian Answers, which won a major prize in Iran, you cover a wide range of territory. More recently, you've been looking specifically at the question of Jesus and now at Mary. And this book has just been, let's see if I can get it in the screen, just been translated into English for those of you who can't read German. The Other Prophet, Jesus in the Quran. Could you tell me a little bit about this book and its method before we get into your current project?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the beginning, from my education, I'm a systematic theologian in Christianity, so I'm not a specialist in Islamic studies. So when I try to dig deeper and work on a problem of Muslim-Christian relations, I always try to do that together with Muslims who are experts in the field. So that's why I co-authored that book with Mohammed, who's a leading Muslim theologian in Germany today, also more a systematic theologian like me. But because he's a systematic theologian, it's not enough that two systematic theologians work together here, because if you want to look at Jesus and the Quran, it's obvious that it's important to have exegetical skills. So we had to include some exegetical scholars in our work, like Zishan Rafah, for example, or also Islamic scholars of Arabic philology, like Angelika Neuwirth and others from the Corpus Coranicum project. And we try to include international scholars from Muslim countries in order to avoid to have a too Western perspective. So comparative theology for me is always a kind of dialogical theology where we cooperate with people from other religions, but at the same time, we try to include what I like to call a third position, a third instance. So somebody who is kind of disturbing that dialogue and bring some expertise from different areas of study, which makes things very complicated and complex. It took me 6 years to work on that book. And we discussed every sentence some thousands of times. And even now, I have to admit that that some things have to be revised in the book 1 year later. So the exciting thing with comparative theology is that it's a really growing discipline, and you learn more and more, and you have to cooperate with historians, with people from philology, with people from other religions. We also include Jewish scholars and scholars from Syriac Christian tradition in our project because of their expertise on that subject. And you learn really a lot also on your own religion, and in this example on Christology when you work like that. I think what I started this project because Jesus Christ is, in my perspective, the biggest obstacle for Christian-Muslim relations, where we most obviously seem to contradict each other. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I still think that it's a big obstacle and that there are big differences. But what I didn't expect is that there are points where I can learn from Islam here, so that even in Christology, there are points in the Quran which are very helpful for Christian reflection.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, for our viewers who may not be as familiar with the place of Jesus in the Quran, there's obviously places that are clear disagreements, most specifically the question of the crucifixion and whether or not it was historically verifiable or happened according to one reading of the four surah. But then there's also a whole bunch of other debates about the Trinity and the Incarnation. Those areas, are there ways that you think you can constructively work past those, or at least have a better understanding, so the disagreements are actually on points of contact rather than historical misunderstandings, before we get to what you might have learned? How might you get around these, what David Burrell calls neurological issues, like the Incarnation, the Trinity, or the crucifixion?
Sometimes it's true that we can get around them, because what the Quran is criticizing is not what Christians today would think or defend. Mm-hmm. Sometimes this can very clearly be shown. But of course, this doesn't mean that in the end there are no differences anymore. But if we take the question of the cross, for example, I'm convinced that this verse in the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, the fourth Surah, 157, doesn't say anything on the question whether Jesus was crucified or not. So the verse only says that the Jews didn't crucify Jesus, which is historically spoken true. The Romans were the persons who killed him. The point of the Quran seems to be that God is the ruling power here and not humans. But at the same time, the fact that the Quran is not interested in the question whether Jesus died or not is very offensive for Christian belief, because the cross is the central event for Christians. You cannot say it doesn't matter whether Jesus was crucified or not. So there still is a difference. There still is disagreement. But it's not a direct contradiction. The Quran simply seems to say, well, I want to make my point differently. So if the point of the crucifixion is to show us that God suffers with us, or that God shows his solidarity with those who are oppressed, then the Quran seems to say, well, this can be shown otherwise as well. Because as Daniel Madigan showed, the Quran itself is suffering. So the rejection which you find in the passion of the gospel is a rejection which is in the Quran, happening for the Quran. So something similar is going on, but not with Jesus, but with the Quran, because the position which Jesus has as word of God is taken in a Muslim context from the Quran, who is the word of God. At the same time, the Quran also says that Jesus is the word of God, and then it becomes very confusing. Why is the Quran saying this? Which is then also confusing for my Muslim interlocutors, who really have a hard job to make sense of that. But that's also one of the very interesting things in comparative theology, that if you think you have now understood both religions, both sides, and can bring them together very fruitfully, then there are disturbing facts in the texts which help us to rethink it, revise it, and dig a bit deeper.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really important in the field of comparative theology and Christian assimilations in the last, 10 years or so is precisely what you're saying, is that often the comparisons as well as the disagreements don't always fall in the way that they naturally seem to. So the question, for instance, of the historicity of the cross, while obviously an important issue in the history of Christian-Muslim debate, isn't actually as problematic as it may be broader claims that Christians want to make about atonement or about suffering. But that you still might find possibilities for this, the ways in which Dan Madigan has argued about, the comparison between Jesus and the Quran rather than Jesus and Mohammed, or the Bible and the Quran. More recently, you've got figures comparing Muhammad and Mary as bearers or ambassadors of the Word of God, and that this then gives us it means that the terrain of the debate is always kind of changing, but it also can be quite exciting that we're not just locked in these same continual debates.
Yeah.
When
in the end, I would always like to find also differences because this is always very helpful, or even especially if you try to appreciate them and try to learn from them. But it was interesting now that in the book, which I co-authored with Mohammed, in the end, he didn't want to see the differences where I wanted to see them. For example, for me, it was very important that the suffering God is very exclusively Christian. I didn't want to see that in the Quran. And even Daniel Madigan doesn't want to see that. So he explains those passages in the Quran where the Quran is rejected in another way than saying in the end that God is suffering. But then my Muslim co-author insisted on having that kind of interpretation. So of a suffering, caring God and understanding the mercy of God as God's compassion. That's also interesting. Now I'm co-authoring another book with Muna Tatari, and she has the opposite idea here. So she's more conservative, which makes me more happy, which is kind of funny. I appreciate more the position which is clearer, distinct from my own tradition.
Do you think that's in part some of the different traditions of Islam that they're coming out of? That they're coming from different positions within the Islamic tradition? That, of course, Islam is much more diverse than just one monolithic tradition, and that some of their own thinking is in line with various strands of Ash'ari Sunnism in the case of Muna, although I know she has an openness to process theology as well, in a way that isn't the case for others.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that contemporary Muslim theologians have to relate to our Western philosophical debates now. So some of them like just to go for a classical thought and have a neo-Mu'tazilite position or even neo-Asharite or Wahhabi positions. But many of them go for process thought, for free will theism. And then it's interesting what they're doing with that. And Muhammad Rashid is an example of somebody who tries to use a lot of ways how Christian German theology has used free will theism for his own Islamic thought. And that's, that's a bit irritating. Although this is something what happened a lot in history. Aquinas copied a lot from Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd.
Yeah.
So, but today we like so much to do our own thing that if somebody is really kind of copying idea, you think, well, you cannot do that. You're in the other religion.
Yeah.
And Muna Tatari is, okay, she's using some processed thoughts, but still she's very careful in sticking to Ghazali and to some classical authors within the Muslim tradition. Maybe this is also easier for me as a Catholic, that somebody always tries to find the old authorities of the own tradition. Yeah. I see that this is, I feel better if somebody's doing that. But at the same time, not everybody is doing that. That's part of modernity. Also, modern Islam, there are thinkers who are very free in their way of developing something new in that area. And that makes it very exciting, but also you really have to think who is a good interlocutor to develop something which is meaningful and influential in both traditions. And I mean, that with Muna Tatari, that works very well. I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that raises an important point about who we choose as who we're engaging, whether those are living theologians or living Muslim intellectuals, or whether those are past figures, and that the problem or the question of choice becomes extremely important. I know, for instance, in English language Islamic theology, the philosophical influences are slightly different. There's some new books coming out on neo-Maturidi theology that tries to bring it in conversation with sort of movements in philosophy of religion, especially sort of the whole reformed epistemology and warrant arguments in the United States, or analytic theology. Those aren't personally even though I am a reformed theologian, those aren't my own philosophical instincts. And so that when we're talking about Christian-Muslim dialogue or comparative theology, we're not talking about the whole of a tradition against another tradition, but a really complex mode of engagement, which I think lends well to your sort of problem-oriented approach to comparative theology, where you're taking a problem or a figure or a question and beginning to engage it. So I know you're beginning, you've got your project on Jesus that's out in both German and English, but you're beginning a much bigger project on prophetology and starting with Mary. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what you're hoping to examine? What's the question you're after?
Yeah, so the first question within my own tradition, so my question within Christian theology is the discovery that we read the prophets only from a Christological point of view. So if we read the church fathers all see the prophets as prefigurations of Christ. Joseph, for example, so the Joseph in the Old Testament is understood as a prefiguration of Christ, and every event of his life helps us to get a better understanding of Christ. Which is sometimes a bit weird if really when he dreams something with bread, this is the Eucharist for the church fathers. And so if he has this coat, it's the coat of Jesus when he's killed. Any detail is used for Christology. So today, in modern theology, we don't like that anymore, but we don't have something instead of this. So we didn't learn a new kind of typological reading. So we think this kind of typological reading of the prophets is supersessionist and should be abolished because it's anti-Judaist. It's against the Jewish autonomy, against the First Testament, against anything what is important, especially in German theology today. But we don't have a very good alternative. So in some way, we have to bring it together with Christ as Christians. And how is this possible without the supersessionism? So how can we learn from the prophets to get to a deeper understanding of Christ? So my question is, can't I learn something from Christ which is not in my consciousness as a Christian? Because Christ obviously is much bigger than my understanding, because it's God, and God is always more than anything I can understand. So obviously, I and also the church, all Christians together, didn't get really the point. We are on our way in understanding. The Second Vatican Council makes this very clear in the Constitution on Revelation, that we don't have the full revelation, but we are on our way. So if I only understand something of Christ, then it's very obvious that the prophets of the Old Testament, and maybe also other prophets, can help me to get a better understanding, to understand Christ more fully. To understand something where I don't see what it has to do with Christ, that's the point where it leads inclusivism. Mm-hmm. So I might learn something where I don't know what to do with it, but it's there and it makes sense and it's challenging. So my idea is that the Quran might be helpful here, because the Quran also has a typological understanding of the prophets, but the typology of the Quran is non-supersessionist. I hope that I will be able to learn from the Quran how to read the prophets in a way that they give me a better understanding of God's word, which is more than my understanding of Christ. And if I look at all the prophets and from a Catholic perspective and try to find the prophet which is most influential within Catholic Christianity, and also in a way influential that it's not absorbed by Christology, but has an independent existence from Christology, then it's Mary and Mariology. I mean, many Protestants don't like that Mary gets so far away from Christ, and Catholics always explain that this is not true and it stays together. But in some sense, it's obvious that Mary shows us more than we know already from Christ. So how can this be integrated in prophetology, which is also then a very interesting Muslim problem, because it's a question whether Mary can be considered as a prophet for Muslims or not. So there are some in the tradition who said that, but it's a minority. And it's interesting. Our interesting question for our book or our project is also how does Muslim prophetology change if we include Mary in prophetology? And the same way I also asked my own Christian tradition, how does it change my view of prophets if I include Mary here? Because the church fathers, it was always clear for them that Mary is a prophet, but it's not in our. If I think of Mary, I don't think of a prophet. That's not my association. Although the Magnificat is very obvious, a prophetic song. So if I look at Mary with the glasses of is she a prophet or not, it's obvious that the biblical Mary is a prophet. But well, she's many other things. And what does it make with the idea of prophecy to include such a vulnerable person as Mary? That's very fascinating. And that's what we try to explore now in the last year. Again, in a group of Muslim and Christian scholars from different denominations and disciplines, with historians, with people who were from the third instance. And this was first step for this larger prophetology project. And so in the end, I hope to be able to learn from the Quran for Christian prophetology, which means to develop a new discipline, because we don't have prophetology as a Christian discipline within Christian dogmatics.
No, I mean, one of the things that I often say about engaging with Christian Muslim dialogue and comparative theology is sometimes you're talking about a shared category, the doctrine of God. Sometimes you're talking about something that maybe is in the Christian tradition, but not particularly present. The speech of God, for instance, is something I'm working on. We tend to talk about the word of God or revelation, but not necessarily the divine attribute of speech. But then you have these other things like prophetology, which is in the Christian tradition, but not often written about. In my own Reformed tradition, we have this notion of the three offices of Christ, where Jesus is the prophet, but then that closes down prophetology going forward in, Calvin or Schleiermacher or Barth. But often this is, as you were saying, more of a typological reality that's often relying on some sort of supersessionism. But again, Mary's not often thought about as a prophet, or at least in recent theology, either Catholic or Protestant. I'm not sure about Orthodox. So why begin with prophetology? Is that a way around the sort of Theotokos debate? Or is it also because Mary's discussed in the Quran more than she is in the Bible in terms of actual references? Are you building up in the same way that you did with the Jesus book from the Quranic depiction of her? Or is there a different method in this project?
No, again, we are really starting with the verses of the Quran. We try to understand them historically. There are a lot of points which were new from me here, even related in comparison with the Jesus book, because sometimes Mary makes things clearer. She shows clearer the political context of things. Mm-hmm. Can give you one example maybe, and try to explain the other things later. So I always, as you know, I always wonder why the Quran says that Jesus and Mary both had to eat their daily food. And I tried to explain, when I was focused on Christology, that the reason for that is that the Quran is attacking an understanding of Christ where Christ is understood without original sin or in the specific hypostatic union with God, which makes him being a person who does not need to eat. So we have this evidence that church fathers in that time, even most of the church fathers, thought that Jesus did not have to eat. So he ate, that's clear. No church father would deny that. But most of them would say because of the hypostatic union, or because he's free of original sin. These are two different arguments, but both were raised by the church fathers and by the all important ones of the 6th and 7th century. So they would all agree and say, well, Jesus didn't have the need to eat and to drink. So when he was 40 days in the desert, he comes back to John the Baptist, and everybody's looking at him and saying, well, you should be hungry. Then he says, oh, well, I'm so hungry and thirsty. But this is because he wants to show his solidarity. He wants to be nice. But in his human nature, he doesn't have the need to eat and to drink. So he could continue for another 40 days without eating, without causing any harm to his nature. So I thought then that the Quran is criticizing that kind of Christology. And I like that criticism for certain reasons. Can explain more, but to come to Mary, the interesting point is that the Quran is saying the same thing for Mary. And I always thought, well, maybe the church fathers say those weird things also on Mary. Why not? As Catholic, that seems to be very normal because we think that Mary is without original sin. Well, the dogma is from 1854, but still, we Catholics think that our dogmas are something what we had from the very beginning on. So I looked at the church fathers and was kind of expecting that the church fathers say the same things for Mary, but they don't. I didn't find any church father. I've asked all the experts and they all say, no, they don't say that. Even in Julianism, which is a very nice heresy in the 7th century on the Arab Peninsula, and usually if you have a certain weird idea in the Quran, you can always explain it with Julianism. But even the Julianists don't say that.
Yeah.
So then I thought, well, but why is the Quran then saying this? Where does it come from? And then what is very interesting is that in the siege of Constantinople, 626, and even already before in 623, there were several sieges where Constantinople was nearly conquered by the Avars and other tribes. Then they had this church of Blachernai with the coat of Mary. Coat is not the English word. The cloak maybe. Yeah. So the cloak was even there, and they had the belief in the popular piety that this cloak will never be destroyed because it shares the impossibility to be destroyed of the body of Mary.
Okay.
And this was used by the emperor. So in the imperial propaganda, this was used. So in the imperial propaganda of Heraclius, it's very important that Mary cannot be destroyed. That's why she was used in wars. She was used in the siege. She was used as many centuries later, a lot of times, but this was actually the first time that Mary was used in battles. And the idea was that it's impossible to destroy Mary because of the incorruptibility of her body. Mm-hmm. And the incorruptibility of the body implies that she does not need to eat and to drink. Right. And now you have the link, and then you will see that this verse is linked to imperial theology of Heraclius. And if you once start to search for that, you will find that many verses of that time, we think that this verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th surah, is from 630-31. So 2 years before the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So in that time, there was Heraclius has conquered Jerusalem. He has won the battle with the Iranians. Now he had time to look what happened on the Arab Peninsula. And Muhammad has won the battle with the Meccans. And he also had time to do something else. So it's obvious that these are now the two powers who were in concurrence. And so what we find here in the Quran is anti-Byzantine propaganda, which is, you can explain a lot of verses, also list 116, very in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where some people think that's a false accusation of the Trinity, Mary part of the Trinity. No, that's all imperial theology. That's always anti-imperial theology, what the Quran is using here. And that's very, very exciting, because I didn't expect that. Now I have to develop something like political theology, although that's your part in Edinburgh.
So the engagement with Mary complicates your previous work. It doesn't change it necessarily directly, because you still have this question. You've pointed to Maximus, for instance, as someone who talks about Jesus electing to eat and drink. However, with the addition of Mary, you had this additional political theological account, this anti-imperial, which also puts it in a broader Quranic framework that maybe isn't as always present. We're not just talking about doctrinal issues, but really a connection between issues of idolatry and power and injustice that run throughout the entirety of the Quranic corpus, which is quite interesting.
And it's very obvious that Christians at court did this prostration for the emperor and also for Mary. I wasn't aware of that. And there's also a political sign to do that kind of proskynesis. And the Quran is very anxious about, especially that sign. You should never do that. And when Mary, for example, and you see that it's in all verses on Mary. For example, in Surah Al-Imran, in the 3rd surah, if the angel meets Mary, then Mary is doing at first the prostration. And there are a lot of Muslim commentaries wondering why she's doing that, because in the Muslim ritual prayer, you should first bow down and then do the prostration. She does it the other way around. Why does she? And then they think, well, she's so pious, that's why she does this. But there's not a good explanation. Then other pious people should do that as well. But the explanation is very easy. If you look at the Syriac fathers say that the angel is prostrating before Mary, because Mary is the mother of God. And so it's very obvious that the angel has to kneel down and do the prostration. So the Quran changes that and makes clear, no, it's Mary who's doing the prostrating before God, not the other way around. So what I didn't expect, that in that verse, where I thought that's a very nice verse for piety, this verse is against traditional Christology in some sense. So sometimes the differences come in verses where you don't expect them. I expected to have a very nice thing, Mary doing prostration. I was searching for Syriac Christians doing those things. But in the end, you see, well, no, it was a quite clear contradiction. But again, a contradiction against imperial theology, like a Byzantine ceremony where this kind of prostration is done for Christ, Mary, and the emperor.
No, and I having been to Istanbul, Constantinople, some of the icons that have been, or they're not icons technically, they're mosaics that have been unveiled in the Hagia Sophia have that sort of interplay of imperial theology with Christ handing over or Mary handing over the power to the emperor. I'm aware of our time, and we've got a number of listeners who have asked some questions, so I'll bring those up. If you have a question that you'd like to add, just put it in the comment box on Facebook and I'll try to read a few. The first is coming from Farhad Qadusi, and they're trying to distinguish between two notions of Mary as prophet, as the one who proclaims or has knowledge of the future, in which case they say, you could affirm this as a prophet, or one who is given a mission to go out to give people. Is this something you're looking at? Is the distinction, for instance, between a Nabi and a Rasul, although those are kind of overplayed, important in thinking about Mary as a prophet, or does this distinction, is this a Quranic distinction that may not, or later Islamic distinction that you don't think is as vital for your own project?
Yeah, so we were discussing a lot that question of Mary being a prophet or prophetess or not. And of course, we looked at this distinction between Nabi and Rasul, and some of the persons in tradition who think that Mary is a prophet, like Ibn Hazm, for example, they would say that she's a Nabi but not a Rasul. If we look at the Quranic point of view, I'm not sure whether this is really helpful, because the Quran seems to have another differentiation between Nabi and Rasul than scholastic theology later says. But I don't want to go into that now. It's a very complicated question, and even experts are not very clear what the Quran is exactly, what is exactly the distinction, because in the Meccan surah, this seems to be quite clear, but in the Medinan ones, it becomes really very, very complicated. So in our book, we try to make the same move like Ghazali. He says, well, there are many important prophets and friends of God. And then he makes an enumeration of many all-important prophets and Mary.
Yeah.
And then you can say, okay, then Mary is just a friend of God and not a prophet. That might be. But she's among those very important persons. So if we seek for orientation in what it means to be holy, what it means to be a role model, what it means to be somebody who is a friend of God, then you should include Mary in the list. And that's important because Mary is such a vulnerable person, because she is shown with many qualities which are not so widespread, also not so obvious with other prophets. So we would like, we do not really claim that she's a prophet or a prophetess. We just claim she is important as a friend of God, and that we can learn for all categories of friends of God, including prophets, we can learn something from including her in the list.
Yeah, that's helpful. Another question, it's more of a, it's not exactly a question, from Mariana Moyard, who's asking, and I had this question as well, how do you see the Quran as developing a non-supersessionist theology? You mentioned that there's a non-supersessionist account. And in some ways, when it comes to prophetology, you could see this, but in other ways, you also have a sense in which a lot of the prophets get connected to Muhammad's life in a way that it's not the same as Christianity. So, for instance, you have the story of Ibrahim, challenging his father, overturning the idols in Ur, leaving. Now, of course, this could be part of Jewish rabbinic tradition that this is coming from, but it also clearly has a connection that Muhammad's actions in Mecca, can be compared to Abraham's or Ibrahim's. Do you think of that as non-supersessionist? I mean, can you say a little bit more for Mariana and I about how it's a non-supersessionist prophetology?
Yeah, it's very obvious that Muslim tradition, as Christian tradition is supersessionist, and the traditional reading of the Quran is a supersessionist reading. But some of my colleagues and students who are Muslims and working on this question would insist that there is a reading of the Quran, a true reading which can be combined with many traditional insights, which is not non-supersessionist, which would be a revision in the sense as it was a revision for Christians to reread the Bible and try to read it in a non-supersessionist way, in relation to Judaism. So I would say, and Marianne Moyet probably as well, that this is possible. But obviously, it's only possible for certain hermeneutics. It's obvious that the text can be read in another way.
Yeah.
So if I want to develop a non-supersessionist hermeneutics of the Quran, then I could, for example, argue that there are said things of Jesus which are not said of Muhammad, like he is the word of God, which is said by no other prophet. So there seem to be things, and I could add more, like he's the Messiah and other points. So the Quran seems to try to include some very important Christian ideas in Christology, and also in Mariology, obviously, like Mary being a virgin and Mary being the most important and most pure of all women of all times. So these are included in a way that some of the Christian, what is most holy for Christians, is try to include it in their own prophetology. So on the one hand, the Quran says all prophets are equal, and well, that's not exactly what Christians want to hear. At least I don't want to hear that. That's already supersessionist from a Christian perspective. Some would even say that Muhammad as the seal of the prophet is the best one, but I think that this is not necessary to read it like this, because the seal just confirms the other prophets, and that they are equal doesn't mean that they are the same, and that we are allowed to make differences doesn't imply that God is not allowed to make differences. And if God is the author of the Quran, as Muslims believe, then God makes differences between the prophets, and obviously he says a lot of confusing things on Jesus, which allows a Muslim today to develop this non-supersessionist reading of the Quran. But I don't pretend that this has already been done. That's a kind of what we are trying to develop together at the moment. And I think it's possible, maybe even easier than a non-supersessionist reading of the Bible, and being not supersessionist with Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly challenges within the Quran or within the Hadith or the broader Islamic tradition of supersessionism. But as you said, it almost seems, obviously there's questions of tahrif, of the Israeliyat debates, but in many ways it seems easier to pull off from the Islamic tradition than the Christian tradition, in part because of the ways in which we have built into our text language of fulfillments of not necessarily replacement, but the ways in which Christianity emerged in relationship to Judaism in the early traditions, which makes it quite challenging. How do we say what we want to say about the uniqueness of Jesus and its relationship to the people of Israel? That, of course, in the Islamic tradition, you do have Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, but there is a long tradition of saying Muhammad is no better or worse than any of the other prophets. He just is the one who is the bearer of this particular message. Now, of course, in the Islamic tradition, the importance of the Hadith and the Sunnah does raise a lot of questions, and that comes to our next comment, which is more a comment than a question, from our friend. I think it was a year ago that we were all in Slovenia. Yeah, exactly. When we could actually travel together. That he's noting that there are differences between the prophet, and some seem to be higher than others. But again, you could easily read this. Maybe you can disagree with me, but higher in terms of maybe the message or the mission, but not necessarily, because you have, he's sent to these people or to this time for these reasons. He's given a book. He's not. Those don't necessarily necessitate a higher in terms of ontological status or salvific import in the way that it might for Christianity. I mean, it's a little simplistic, but there is a sense in which Christian revelation culminates in Jesus in a way that in Islam, the Prophet, of course, brings the Quran, which is the Furqan, or the criteria, but it also confirms what has come before it. It doesn't necessarily tell you something new that you didn't know before, right? There's a sense of repetition in the Quran that isn't the case, I would say, in the dominant Christian tradition, which it relates to this issue of supersessionism and prophetology.
Yeah, and there is even a reading of the Quran. For example, Mohammed Legenhausen, another co-traveler, he tries to explain there is a reading of the Quran where that the Quran confirms Jesus being the gospel. Yeah. So that he's not bringing a gospel, that he is the gospel, which is very close to the Christian idea, what is really peculiar in Jesus, that he's not only bringing something, but he is the message.
Yeah, he's Rasul and Risala.
Sorry?
Oh, I would say, in Arabic, you could say that Jesus is both Rasul and Risala, both the message and the messenger at the same moment.
Exactly. The Quran can be read like this. Yeah. And this is obviously a big difference to other prophets. But this doesn't make Jesus higher from a Quranic point of view. There are other prophets which have other things to contribute. Like Mary has things to contribute no male prophet can contribute.
Yeah.
Obviously also Muhammad or Abraham or Moses, they all have to bring something peculiar to their tradition. So there are repetitive elements, but there are also some peculiar points which we can learn from different prophets.
Yeah, great. So I'm aware we're getting close to the end of our time. I've got a couple more questions maybe that we can get to before we need to wrap up, get back to our children. So I see one. Now, I don't know how you'll respond to this because I know you've worked on the Trinity, but is there a way in which you think prophetology, he's corrected it later, is important to do from a non-Trinitarian perspective for Christian-Muslim dialogue? Or is this something, I don't want to answer it for you, but do you think that the Trinity then becomes an important part of this process, or at least a way of reading the Trinity in relation to prophetology? Is that what you're getting at? Or you can clarify. I'm not sure because it's not my question.
Yeah, so I also worked a lot on the Trinity, also the relationship of the Trinity of the Quran, and I think there is a Tawhidic understanding of the Trinity, that it's only an explanation of Tawhid, and this is even mainstream within Christianity. Yeah. So if you don't adopt a social Trinitarianist point of view, which is probably problematic for Muslims like Moltmann or other do, which still is, I don't want to say it's bad, but if you don't go in that direction and prefer Latin Trinitarianism in the tradition of Aquinas or Augustine, then you don't have problems with the Quran and with Tawhid. And I think the Quran is very much aware of that. I don't see any verse in the Quran criticizing really the Trinity. So I worked on those verses which are usually used to pretend that this is against the Trinity, but I only see that some misunderstandings are criticized by the Quran. I don't see that. I would say the Quran doesn't think it's helpful to say three. That's clear. That's said explicitly. But the Trinity is not shirk for the Quran. It's not something which is a heresy. It's not recommended for Muslims to do that. That's clear. But there is a way of appreciating that Christians are different than Muslims, and then they can develop their Trinitarian thought. If it is explained how it's consistent with Tawhid, I don't see that this is a problem.
In the later Islamic theological tradition, a lot of the debates about sifat, attributes of God, revolve around these questions of, this is a classical philosophical debate. How can we make distinctions within the one? And this is the case in Greek philosophy and in Judaism and Islam. So it's not necessarily unique. And even someone, to use a Greek a Greek or Eastern Christian, John of Damascus, his account of the Trinity is not nearly as social as the Cappadocians are read. I don't necessarily think they are as social as Moltmann and others think they are. So there is a way in which the primacy of Tawhid can still be engaged within a prophetology. We got one more question and then we'll wrap up, which is coming from Baxter, and it's to your comment earlier about Mary and Muhammad. Maybe you can just read it before. Is this something you'll be exploring?
Yeah, sure. So the question of sin is very interesting because it seems so that Mary is also in the Muslim tradition without sin. Her purity is explicitly claimed in a verse in the Quran. And at the same time, there's this hadith saying that she's protected from Satan, and because of the prayer of her mother. That's very interesting, that the prayer of the mother causes her protection and the protection of Jesus from Satan. So there are a lot of similarities between Mary and Muhammad. That's a whole chapter in our book. That's really a lot to say about both bearers of God's word and both queer figures. I think Yerusha Tanner Rhodes explained that a bit, how both can be read as queer figures, as queers of heaven. So not only Mary, but also Muhammad. But this would also take some more time to explain. Yeah. So let's keep with the question of sin. It's interesting that the passage of the Bible, which most obviously seem to imply that Jesus and Mary are sinners, are those passages where they have disputes to each other. So Jews would say that Jesus is a big sinner because he says so bad words against his mother. Yeah. I have Jewish friends who told me that when I was explaining the idea of Jesus being without sin, and he said, well, you cannot be a bigger sinner than somebody who is so disrespectful with his mother. Yeah. And the other way around, Mary seems to have a big trouble. She didn't understand Jesus for a long time and made him a difficult life for a certain time. So there are some verses in the Gospel of Mark especially, but also in the other synoptic Gospels seeming to imply something which seems to be difficult to bring together with purity. So we try to make sense of those verses which are not mentioned in the Quran. That's interesting. The Quran is not mentioning those verses, but they can be included in the concept of purity. So it also helps to define sin. If you see that it's not sin to have trouble with your parents, and to not to understand the mission of your son, doesn't seem to be something which separates you from God. It's allowed not to understand something, to have troubles, and to So we try to argue in our book that there is a way how the Muslim way of understanding the purity of Mary can be very interesting for a Christian reading, but it's obviously not the same, especially not the Catholic one, which is a bit special here.
Great. Well, I'm aware that we're coming to the end of our time. Let me just thank you, Professor von Stosch, again for taking the time to engage us. For those of you who don't read German, be sure to go out and buy the book, The Other Prophet, Jesus in the Quran, which has just been recently published by Ginkgo Press. You can find it as well as any booksellers. And we look forward to your future work and more conversations. Also, just a comment that we're coming from the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh with some support from the Henry Luce Foundation. And we'll be having similar conversations throughout the summer with leading scholars like my colleague, Mona Siddiqui, a friend of mine, Bashir Saida from the University of Stirling, Deanna Womack, and others. And we hope to be in conversation throughout the summer about the emerging field of Christian-Muslim relations. But thank you again, Klaus, and we look forward to the fruits of all of your labor when we get to read this book on Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very nice to be here.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.